Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Shoephoria Podcast. I'm Paul Griffin, Simon Bartold's partner on the education platform in Bartold Clinical. Today, I'm asking the questions on Shoephoria because, frankly, Simon Bartold's the best person to answer them. The running retail scene, it's a jungle out there, a shifting landscape of product innovation clashing with subjective opinions. We're forever having to educate and update on new paradigms, new products, creative innovations. But the one thing that seems to stick around is this theory of motion control or controlling foot pronation by prescribing or recommending specific running shoes. This presents a swag of problems moving forward as the running shoe development moves on with evidence and leaves the motion control paradigm in its wake, forcing retail and prescribing clinicians to speak a new language. There's a lot of noise that can lead one astray, and it's a common topic of discussion between Simon and I on our regular catch-up calls. So after a few member requests, we decided to do a podcast between ourselves on this topic. So Simon mentions in the beginning of the podcast that it's not a true reflection of the running shoe retail and health clinician scene across the board, as we appreciate there's some very high-level operators who have fantastic systems and processes to ensure their customers and patients get exactly the outcomes they're after. But there are some that are slipping through the very large evidence-based cracks, and we believe product design and development is driving us into uncharted waters as we've never seen before at a rapid pace. It's important that we provide some consistency in advising consumers in keeping with the latest evidence that motion control is well and truly dead, and it has been for some time. Simon and I also discuss the results of a recent health practitioner footwear prescriber survey that we floated on our social media channels with some seriously surprising results that expose some glaringly obvious issues that indicate we are not moving with the times. So, we recognise the need to educate and create a clearer pathway from brand to consumer and everything in between. So just before I go and get into the juicy part, Simon and I would like to thank you for listening to our podcast, Shoephoria. And if you get the time and energy, please subscribe to the channel and write a short review. Righto, listeners, let's go and bust some myths.
You're listening to the Shoephoria Podcast by Bartold Clinical. Listen in as we delve deep into the world of evidence-based sports science, sports medicine, and athletic footwear science. Let's go and bust some myths.
Thanks for tuning in, everyone. It's Paul Griffin here, talking with the one and only Simon Bartold. Today, we are going to discuss the world of running footwear retail. In particular, we're going to discuss motion control. But before we get onto that, we're going to have a brief chat to introduce, obviously, Simon Bartold and Bartold Clinical. So, Simon, over to you about Bartold Clinical. It started in 2012.
Yeah, so really it started in 2012 as Bartold Clinical. That was the first name of it. And really it came about because I was going through my computer one day and I noticed that I had a whole lot of stuff that I thought one or two people might be interested in. As it turns out, more than one or two people were interested in it, and it's kind of evolved from there. We had a name change. I don't know, Griffin, correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was probably 2018 we changed it to Bartold Clinical, which is more appropriate because it sort of started out as servicing the podiatry profession, but then we realised that there was much broader interest from physios and chiropractors, osteopaths, sports doctors. We even had an orthopaedic surgeon or two on board. So, yeah, we wanted to broaden the platform and make it, I guess, a bit more generalised, but still really focusing on things like athletic footwear and sports injury.
So just to correct you there, I think you said Bartold Clinical. It started out as Bartold Biomechanics and we flipped it to Bartold Clinical. But yeah, you're spot on. We do have a diverse range of subscribers to the webpage across all spectrum of professions and right the way through. So the aim is to create this community of people involved in lower limb sports medicine education, athletic footwear education globally. Yep.
Yeah, I think so. And it's quite interesting because I believe we've got members from every continent excepting Antarctica at the moment. So we've got to work on that, mate. That's not good enough.
Well, flipping the webpage to multilingual was really handy, actually. I think we had quite a few pick up in Spain and all the Spanish-speaking countries as well. So that's been fantastic. So over 250 evidence-based articles, opinion pieces, webinars, narrated PowerPoint presentations, how-to videos for clinicians. Obviously, it's fantastic podcasts and so on and so forth. But also just on Bartold Clinical, Simon and I do provide a a consultancy to the footwear industry. We innovate and develop performance athletic footwear ourselves. Simon's currently with X-Blades, and I'm currently with Osaka Corporation, a group out of Antwerp, designing hockey shoes. So any more to add with that one, Simon?
No, I think you mentioned the word community, and one of the things I love about Bartold Clinical is that it is quite an interactive community. So we do have a lot of communication, and the members do get quite involved. And it's a very unique platform because we really empower the members to let us know what they want. So basically, if you're a member, you can request content, and if we possibly can, we will build that content for you. In fact, we encourage that. And I'm not aware of any other website on the internet that allows that.
Well, that's the good segue into our discussion today. We did have a request from a number of people over the last few months to talk about this retail landscape, and in particular motion control and the confusion surrounding this. And we talk about this almost on a daily basis when we catch up, the frustration of the landscape. And we thought, look, the best thing to do is just to have one of our conversations on the podcast, put it out there so we can create some discussion amongst the community. So we feel, obviously I'll hand over to you with this one, but basically there's a disconnect between what the evidence says and what is being told at the retail to the consumer. So let's start from the beginning. With reference to running shoes, what is motion control and how did it forge such a massive space in the footwear industry and the footwear fitting?
Okay, well, I might just preface that question by making a comment that I would not want anybody at all to think that this was us dumping on retail, because I want to make it quite clear that there are a lot of retail people out there who understand footwear at an extremely sophisticated level, and they're very up to date, and they can discuss advanced biomechanics and have an advanced understanding of current concepts. So I just want to make that quite clear that these comments are probably more aimed at people who are falling behind, and the goal of this is for it to be a productive, a positive conversation rather than a negative one. So what we're trying to do here is identify some of the issues that you need to be aware of and that will eventually catch up and potentially bite you on the bum unless you sort of get on board with it. Now, you asked the question about motion control and where that had all come from. And basically, the answer to that is it came from a concept that was embedded in podiatric biomechanics, or the biomechanics that's taught to podiatrists. And the essence of that was that somehow we would be able to identify what is called a criteria for normalcy. In other words, we would be able to say what's normal in a runner or a walker or a sports person and what is not. Now, I think we can put that to bed right now and say that that was a theory that was developed over 40 years ago by 4 podiatrists. It's only ever been a theory, and we are absolutely categorically not able to define what is normal in any human. And the reason we can't do that is that there's just too much variability. So this concept that you should then somehow be able to match footwear to an individual athlete based on whether they should be controlling their pronation with a motion control shoe or have a more or less stable platform is fundamentally and fatally flawed. And that's not just me having an opinion. That is what the science is telling us. And there has been a fairly quantum shift away from this concept of looking at pronation, supination, and somehow trying to match that to footwear, because we understand that it's just not supported by the science and it basically doesn't make any sense.
Sure. So to add to that, let's just suggest that the theory was proposed and the footwear companies went out and said, look, the way in which we can innovate to cater for this motion control market is we can change either the density of midsole, or we can change the interface between the foot and the ground to influence foot movement. So change the density of the midsole. We can put some plastic bars in there. We can kind of change the angle of the heel counter, or we can do it. We can develop a product which is trying to manipulate normal foot movement from someone who can be identified as being, let's just say, for an overpronator. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that statement, but this is where it falls down, because we have no line in the sand. We don't know how much is too much pronation and we don't know how much is too little pronation. It's much better to look at how athletes work within an envelope of function. In other words, you can have some athletes who are extremely pronated, and that's completely normal for them. They function perfectly well. They don't get injured. You can have other people who have a small amount of pronation or a small amount of supination, and they don't cope with that for whatever reason. Our job's not to put a number on the pronation or supination. Our job is to find out why it is they're getting injured and why they're not functioning the way they should be. That's the key issue.
Okay, gotcha. So let's not just pick on, say, the motion control product. Let's have a look at some other categories of shoes, because obviously the brands said, look, let's try and identify someone's mechanics, and then that would be done subjectively via, we've got online portals. Even the brands have online portals to try and allow B2C to identify anomalies within themselves and make that subjective claim as to what product they need. So let's have a look at some other categories of footwear outside of the motion control shoe that classify someone generally.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't mind focusing on motion control because I just hate it so much. And as far as I'm concerned, it's a dead category in the water. I mean, we've talked about it so much, but in its truest expression, it's probably a 1 in 1,000 runner shoe. So some people do need a lot more support, but in the context of runners, it's a very, very small percentage of people. So basically, the industry's been defined by two great paradigms, hasn't it? I mean, one is motion control and the other is cushioning, or should we say pronation control and cushioning. So if we focus on cushioning, it has its own category, which unsurprisingly is called cushioning category. And again, we've sort of been maybe looking in the wrong direction here, because cushioning category it's always been supposed that we had to do something about the impact that occurred when your foot struck the ground. So we call this the vertical component of the ground reaction force. Quite simply, it's how much the ground hits you when you hit it. And we assumed that this impact load or impact force was somehow contributing to injury, just as we assumed that pronation was contributing to injury. Now, what the literature tells us, and I could call up very easily in probably 5 minutes, I could probably call up 50 papers that supported this statement. What the literature tells us is that there has never been, in a proper randomized control trial with decent power, there's never been a study published ever that has made the direct link between excessive pronation and injury. Not ever, not one.
Wow,
so that's a pretty big red flag for a start. So we have assumed that was the case, but it isn't proven in the literature. In relation to cushioning, we've always assumed that cushioning would reduce the big peaks that we see in impact and that therefore you wouldn't get injured. Again, the literature does not support this. In fact, we can show quite clearly that if you have a harder shoe, a shoe with a harder midsole, you actually get a reduction in the peak impact loads, and that's because it changes the spring behavior of your lower limb, what we call lower limb stiffness. So there's a very good biomechanical reason for that. But in essence, to cut this short, the two great paradigms are not supported in 2020 by what we understand from the science. So I'm not saying at all that cushioning is not important, because it is. It has very important characteristics in terms of comfort, which is super important. Comfort equals function equals performance. And it also is very important in terms of energy return. So we do understand, especially when we look at these terrific new shoes from Nike, the Vaporfly family, that they're returning more energy than any other shoe in the history of athletic footwear, and it's offering an energetic advantage to the athlete. So cushioning quite clearly is important, but not for the reasons we initially thought.
Okay, so let's think about the consumer for a second. The consumer's thinking of buying a new pair of running shoes and they believe they need stability. Let's talk about the difference between stability and motion control and how that can get confused.
Okay, so that's a really good and really important question, actually. So motion control is this perception that somehow you're going to be able to stop the foot from pronating based on your theory that pronation is bad, which it's not. It's very important, it's very normal, and you can't walk or run without pronation. But you've got into a store and somebody said, geez, that's the worst case of pronation I've ever seen, and you may well die from that pronation. Well, they might not say that, hopefully, but you never know. So you whack them in a motion control shoe. Well, number one is your foot will still quite happily pronate inside that shoe. And we know that because there's been tons of studies where little windows have been cut in the back of the shoe, and we can see the foot moving inside the shoe quite happily. So that's number one. Number two is that the motion control strategies that have been put into that shoe are most likely to make it much stiffer, much less flexible, and much heavier. So the weight is an issue because weight is a penalty no athlete wants. So there's a couple of big no-nos there. And I think when we talk about stability, for me, we're talking about something completely different. Stability for me is not motion control. Stability is a description of what the platform offers in terms of how the foot sits on top of it. So in other words, does the foot sit to one side of the platform or not? And that's a very important thing that most people don't look at. Maybe does the platform collapse through the middle of the foot? That's also quite important. Does the platform make you in-toe or out-toe more, which some shoes also do? That's the stability component. I think we should try to separate it in our minds from motion control, which is only focusing on pronation or supination, what we call motion in the frontal plane. Now, if I was a runner, my focus would be not on that. My focus would be, how do I get from the start of my run to the end of my run with the least fatigue, the most energy I can have, and the most efficiency? And that's not about frontal plane or pronation or supination. It's about how effectively you can transition from the point of contact, wherever that might be, to toe off. And we call that forward progression or forward transition. So that's the most important thing. And that can be limited by some things. Like, for example, if you've got a reduced range of motion in your ankle or a reduced range of motion in your big toe, then that will affect that, and so can the shoe. The shoe can either enhance it or it can limit it. So I think that's really where we are in this moment in the world of footwear science, and it's quite an important paradigm shift, I think.
Yeah, I think just my comment on that, when I developing footwear, I try and think of the concept of stability as being at the point within the load, the contact point of the gait cycle, that the shoe has enough characteristic at what point in time, so it creates that environment as being like a level of confidence, or it is stable. I guess that's exactly what it is. It's not so much controlling anything. It's just that it has the behaviour to suit the intended need. Would that be fair enough?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, as I said, I think we've been looking in the wrong direction. I think we've focused so much on pronation, supination, but actually running the action is a little bit like the movement you see on a bicycle. It's a circular or half circular movement. It's actually got a name. It's called the Ruina-Gomez model, and it's the model of a half bicycle wheel. So if you can imagine half a bicycle wheel and how that rocks forward and back, that's the sort of motion we look for when we do gait analysis, that we want to see this model of perpetual movement, and that's got very little to do with pronation and supination. It's far more important to be looking in what we call the AP, or the anterior-posterior direction. It's important to look at how much braking is occurring. In other words, how much are you being decelerated when you hit the ground, and how effectively are you accelerating? And those things we look at in what's called FY, which is the anterior-posterior component of the ground reaction force. So it's different than looking at the vertical component. So
just touching on stability still before we move on, if you consider the shoe at the moment, the Vaporfly and the carbon plate, there's often discussion about the carbon plate providing stability because of the amount of foam. So that's a good example of how stability is utilised in a performance athletic footwear, as opposed to it being stability being related to motion control. So that's pretty important. So Simon, we recently placed a survey out on our social media, and we had over 200 responses for that survey, and it was specifically looking at the perception of footwear prescription, which actually led us to have this discussion today about motion control, because there was some damning evidence in there. So we're about to bust some myths on this. If we have a look at the responders, most of those, 75% were podiatrists, then the rest made up of physiotherapists, chiropractors, some running coaches, fitness people, so on and so forth. Now, the most important running footwear feature, I'm not sure if you can bring that page up. You must have, if you got it in front of you?
Yep, I got it in front of me.
Okay, most important running footwear features. You can see here, 45% said cushioning was the most important feature. Flexibility, 17%. Lightweight, 46%. Midfoot stability, 40%. Now, we'll talk about that in a second. Motion control, 22%. 20% stiff heel counter. And then 63% width and fit was the most important. Then there was a few others like stack height and offset and so on, which actually there was a big figure in offset. 42% felt that the heel to toe drop was an important factor within running footwear. So I'm going to let you have free rein to comment on this, because I know that there's some things here that will rub you up the wrong way. Go for it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when we talk about, as I said before, these are the things that normally make me froth at the mouth. So it's lucky this is an audio recording. But when we talk about things like midfoot stability, what that tells me is we've still got people who are doing the twist test or breaking the shoe in the middle of the shoe as a means of determining stability. Now, if you grab a shoe and you bend it in half at the middle, you have broken the shoe. And I'm here to tell you there is no force of nature that will allow that to happen to a shoe. So it's a complete waste of time, and you should stop doing it right now, because it tells us nothing. The reason it concerns me that people are assessing footwear that way is that they're not actually understanding that you can have a very lightweight, very flexible shoe that is still very, very stable. It just achieves it in different ways than you've traditionally been taught. So you've been taught that stability revolves around things like a stiff heel counter, which it doesn't. It revolves around things like the shoe itself being quite rigid, which it should not be. It revolves around things like having a TPU shank, which it shouldn't have. And it ignores the things that can improve stability, like decoupling of the midsole, geometry of the midsole, specific flex points in the midsole. We know from the research that all of these things are far more powerful in terms of changing important biomechanical parameters like looking at joint moments and looking at joint ranges of motion than the traditional stability components. So what this survey is telling me is that people are still locked into a very traditional motion control way of thinking, because we've got 40% who are looking at midfoot stability and 22% who are looking at motion control and another 20% who think that a stiff heel counter is important when it's not. So, I think it is really a little bit damning in terms of it saying, gee, people are not actually moving on and they're not actually understanding. I'm encouraged by the fact that almost 17% of people think that flexibility is important. But what we don't know, Paul, is whether they think it's important in a positive or a negative way. So I could interpret that as saying that 17% of people are saying if it's flexible, it's bad. I don't know. We didn't ask that question. But it is pretty interesting that, we've still got a lot of people in the clinical world, because mostly clinicians who answered this questionnaire, who are thinking that rigidity and stability and motion control are still quite important.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the point that I think hits home, is that the responders are people that refer people for running footwear. And not only that, they act as an advocate for their health concerns. So really, we need to start thinking about evidence-based prescription as opposed to these old models which still exist. So I'm going to talk briefly about another category that we had with the response, another question we had, which was what category of footwear? So we had neutral, cushioning and motion control. And the question was, what category of running shoes do you most commonly recommend? Now, 60% recommended neutral, cushioning 14%, and then there was still over 15% that recommended motion control. Comments?
Yeah, of course. I mean, almost 15.5% of people still recommending motion control shoes for what I've clearly stated, I think, is a 1 in 1,000 runner shoe. And my contacts in retail, whom I really respect, so the guys who really at the pointy end, they're telling me that their retail sales of motion control shoes are somewhere between 5 and 7%, and they reckon that's about where it should be. This is telling me there's a major disconnect, so that the professions are recommending double what people at the coalface really think should be being recommended. So far too much motion control category as far as I'm concerned. In neutral category, 60%, that doesn't really surprise me. I think, again, we're dealing with clinicians, and a lot of people would probably are looking for a shoe to put an orthotic device in. Now, that opens another whole can of worms about, well, how do you match an orthotic to athletic footwear? And that's probably actually a question for another whole podcast, because I'm not sure we have time to delve into that right now. It's quite a thorny question. But, I think that is telling us that there is a bit more of a swing back to less structured footwear that's a bit more responsive. And I would say that's probably a positive trend.
Yeah, well, look, the good news is, after all of that bad news, there is good news. The following question we asked on the questionnaire was, would you like to improve your technical knowledge of sports footwear? And there was an overwhelming response. 95.9% said yes, they would. So there's 4.1% of very confident people out there, but 95.9% said yes, they would. So that tells me, or tells us, that the people that filled out the survey, they're also a bit confused about the landscape. So we need to provide a better communication portal or platform to educate practitioners, especially these types that responded to the survey, so that they can then advise their patients appropriately so that the outcomes are improved. Because at the moment we've got, obviously some skewed outcomes, being that if you're only as good as your teacher, if the person advising isn't overly confident in what to recommend, then we can obviously appreciate that the outcomes aren't going to be great.
Yeah, look, I completely agree. And I think this is a really interesting question that's been asked. Every single one of the people who filled out this survey answered this question, and it's essentially a 100% response rate. So, it's 96% essentially. And again, remembering this is clinicians. So what this is telling me is there is a lot of confusion out there about all the issues that are swirling around us, categorization of footwear or segmentation, whatever you want to call it. But it does call up the bigger question, which brings us back to the start of this little podcast, and that's retail. So if the clinicians, the medical crew are confused, where does that leave retail, Paul? What are they doing and what are they leaning on? Where are they getting their education from? Are they completely up to date? And I think the answer from our observation is almost certainly no, they're not. They're still working on quite antiquated models. And on that basis, they're really probably not getting to the nub of the prescription process. So the consumer's not walking out of the store with the shoe that might best suit them, I think. I think it's a fair comment.
Yeah, looking at it at the moment, the disconnect continues right the way through from product development through to retail. So now brands are starting to develop product that is nowhere in keeping with the motion control paradigm. So then that really leaves the people such as the ones that responded to this survey in a black hole, because if they don't have the motion control product to refer to, then what are they going to do? They're just going to tick neutral, or they're just going to tick the discretion of the technical retail, which really takes away the power of their advocacy as trying to work for the best interests of the athlete or the best interests of the patient. So I've done a bit of homework, and obviously we understand the landscape, but the brands have a little bit to offer as far as how they educate. And I'm on a major brand website at the moment, and I'm looking here and they're talking about structured and cushion stability shoes and what they're for and so on and so forth. And that's educational, but it's really outdated. And it's not really in keeping with the type of product that they're manufacturing at the moment. So I think everything sort of needs to be aligned. At the moment, I feel it's decentralized, and there's a lot of opinion and emotion depending on what training or school of thought you come from. And I think, you've always sort of said where the development side of footwear is we're starting to take things out of shoes and making them lighter as opposed to adding things in, then I firmly believe we need to start educating better through better mediums to ensure that there's a more consistent approach right the way through from product development through to retail, so that the consumer has a better outcome from their footwear fitting experience to the product use as well.
Yeah, look, I think it's a really interesting point you bring up. And, I've also been on that website you've mentioned. And I mean, I'm a bit shocked by that, to be quite honest, because, we have really moved on from that. And I think it's very easy to try to maintain the status quo. So to actually change your mind on these things does require a bit of hard work, and it requires trying to upskill yourself, basically. That's what it needs. And that needs to come from the clinicians, it needs to come from retail, and it does also need to come from the manufacturers. And as long as they are maintaining this sort of information on their websites, it's going to be quite a difficult struggle to get people to get with it, basically. I think it's a little bit like, if my podiatry practice now was 100% based around churning out orthotic devices, I know that in the next 4 or 5 years, my business model is going to fail, because that's not where we're at. Of course, orthotic therapy is still a very valuable treatment modality, but it's not the treatment modality. And I think that the really good practitioners are, they're starting to expand the way they think about all of this, and they're starting to add other arrows in their quiver of treatment, if you like. And the manufacturers and retail need to do this also. They need to understand that you just got to be a bit more evidence-based, and you can't just blindly accept paradigms that are 40 years old and are disproved. And that's the fact. They're not true.
I think you made a really good point there. And I'm right in front of me right now. Obviously, I can't show you, it's a podcast, but you can hear it. That is a traditional last, and this is a anatomical last. And so we've always discussed the differences between these ourselves, but I think this obviously change in engineering and footwear development and manufacturing can make a massive difference to the performance of a shoe. So in recent times, anatomical lasting has become the new thing, and we're seeing footwear come out on the rack that sits amongst shoes that are made on traditional lasting. And we see them just sitting there as far as like, okay, you can use this shoe that has an anatomical last and it will actually, make a significant difference to the performance of the shoe. And you'll sort of see, let's say, for example, the Nike Infinity React, which is the shoe of the moment with 52% less injuries compared to the Nike Structure. They did their internal study. That shoe has an anatomical last. And when you place it on in the store, it's going to feel different to a traditional lasted shoe. And I believe that the Structure is a traditional last. So we're now talking about a shoe which has a contoured top of the midsole, not unlike, say, a Croc or a Birkenstock, that then has an effect of a full contact feeling. So in store, say someone puts this shoe on, they walk around, they feel it's kind of a bit lumpy in the arch and it's kind of more anatomical, and it's different. It's different to a traditional shoe. So how does retail know that that shoe is manufactured different and can influence outcomes? How does the consumer know when they go and see the Infinity React Run advertised as being the next shoe? And how do these consumers who wear orthotic insoles, how do they want to place their orthotic in Infinity React Run when it's already contoured? It's not really going to work. So we're now dealing with this product developments advancing so rapidly that the education process to retail and consumer is not there. So we need to kind of improve that space.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think there are going to be so many challenges across all of these industries. So for clinicians, for retail, and for the manufacturers, you've touched on anatomical lasting. Now, this process was not even able to be done 12 months ago. It was not possible from a manufacturing perspective. So it's moved so fast that now we can do this, and it's simply a better way. There's no doubt about that. We've got to understand what's happening, what is going to come with 3D printing, with 3D manufacturing of individual lasts for individual athletes. And we've got all sorts of things like being able to bleed PU now, which means that we'll be able to zone a shoe so that it has changes in properties in different zones of the shoe, so that you should then be able to prescribe a shoe, not just for an athlete, but for where that athlete plays on a field. So if you're a netballer and you're a goalkeeper, you're playing a different game than if you're a centre player. And there's also going to be a difference in the retail landscape. So technical retail, the good ones, will not only survive but thrive. But I think there'll also be a big swing towards retail from sports medicine clinics and things like that. And so, you mentioned education, and education is the key. There's a fantastic quote from Malcolm X, the great American civil rights leader, and it says, "Education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today." And that is just such a powerful quote, because if you don't prepare for it right now, and you're in retail, or you're a clinician, or you want to manufacture innovative high-end footwear, if you are not preparing for what's coming, then you will fail. It's that simple. There's never been a time like this in the athletic footwear industry, and the education side of it is critical if you want to succeed. I think it's the factor X, the factor Malcolm X.
Unbelievable. Simon Bartold working Malcolm X into the Bartold Clinical Shoephoria Podcast. That's brilliant. I love it. Before we truck on to conclude this and wrap it up, I'm going to ask you one question, because I really know that this is your favourite category. What is your favourite motion control shoe of all time?
Well, look, you know what? The obvious answer is the Brooks Beast. I mean, you've got to give it credit. You've got to give it credit. You've got to give it credit. The reason I love it, it is a beast. It refuses to die. You can harpoon it, you can shoot it, you can stab it, but it's still there. It just won't go away.
We want names of people that ran a marathon in that thing. They need their own honour board. People that completed the 42Ks, 42.5Ks in the Brooks Beast, they deserve their own honour roll.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I'm not having a shot at the Brooks Beast at all. I mean, I do actually have real respect for what that shoe has offered historically. I mean, in its time and place, it was an iconic shoe because it did reflect the thought of the time, and it reflected the science of the time, as a matter of fact. So, and there are probably still some people out there, your big, heavy dude who is very pronated, whether he be overpronated or underpronated, we'll never know, but that shoe works for him. And the take-home message here is that the key about prescribing footwear is you want the least amount of shoe you can possibly have to achieve the task at hand. That might be a Vibram 5 Fingers, or it might be a Brooks Beast. It's athlete specific. It depends on the athlete.
I think the Brooks Beast had applications far further than running. Like there was a lot of adult-acquired flat foots and, spring ligament issues or tibialis posterior, these types of things where people really struggle to live day to day, and they really rely on the Brooks Beast to give them their capabilities to get around without too many issues. So I think it had its space and its time. So
for sure.
So just to conclude, thank you all for listening. Thank you, Simon. And thank you all for subscribing to our podcast channel. We're really enjoying having Shoephoria out there. And you're welcome to also follow us on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. We're not sharp enough to be on TikTok yet, are we, Simon? Do you know what TikTok is?
It's the noise a clock makes, mate.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly it. No, have you still got your MySpace site up, or is that gone down?
I probably have got an account open there somewhere.
MySpace. Oh, you can hit us up on what Google Meetings, or what's it called? I don't know. No, what was it called, the Google one? I can't remember. Anyway, there's a few of them out there, but we're on the major ones, and we've got different content on different platforms. We really appreciate you following us, and we're trying to create that community where, eventually we'll get to the point where we have that single educational piece for people to come to and get their fix for lower limb sports medicine and athletic footwear. So thanks for your support, and we look forward to having you on board for the next episode of Shoephoria. Thank you, Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And I mean, Paul's being terribly modest here, but I just need to point out that Paul is incredibly accomplished in the world of athletic footwear in his own right and has vast experience in the world of sports medicine. So he's kind of lurking in the background there and playing his own abilities down, but we have a very sharp mind and someone who has very great perception and insight into athletic footwear. So my turn to thank you for your part in this podcast, Paul, and thanks to everybody listening.
Oh, thank you, Simon. It's very kind of you, kind words, and look forward to the next one. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for joining us for the Shoephoria Podcast by Bartold Clinical. Join us next time.